Let's talk about the concept of developmental niche. This is basically the cultural context of development. So, the developmental niche refers to all the components of culture that affect a child's development. So, let's talk about typical development first. Infants are considered young children within their first year of life. And then toddlers are 2 and 3 year olds who are typically more mobile than infants. And it's really important for social workers to be able to know what typical development is to be able to pinpoint whenever problems arise. So, like I mentioned before, the developmental niche is what gives is when culture guides the aspects of the developmental process. And there's really three major categories here. There are the physical and social settings of daily life, customs of childcare and child rearing, and psychology of caregivers. Let's talk a little bit about what each of these categories mean. So, some examples of physical and social settings of daily life are shape and size of the living space, um, objects, toys, reading materials, what kind of things are available in the home, the nutritional status of the children, the family structure, multiple generations living in one place, or how multiple generations of a family interact with one another and the roles that they have in the family, the presence or absence of a mother or father, the presence of multiple caregivers, the role of siblings as caregivers, and the presence and influence of peer group members. So these are the physical and social settings that a child interacts with in their daily life that affects their development. Customs of childcare and child rearing are um, what is specific to your culture. So this could be regionally, this could also be the culture of your generation, this could be where you're located, um, but different cultures, whether geographic cultures or generational cultures or family cultures, have different customs when it comes to raising children. One consideration is sleeping and feeding. If any of you have been a new parent recently, you will know that sleeping and feeding are two very hot topics for new parents because parents want to do the right thing for their child, and figuring out what kind of customs families will use for sleeping patterns and feeding patterns often are difficult choices. So, for sleeping patterns, we're usually thinking about co sleeping versus sleeping alone. In some cultures, co sleeping is completely normal and used widely. In America, sleeping alone is recommended because of the research that has been out about sudden infant death syndrome or SIDS. Then dependence versus independence training. So, how much emphasis is put on having the child learn how to do things versus a parent doing things for them. As I mentioned before, feeding can be a controversial issue, and the issue generally is surrounding breastfeeding and formula feeding in infancy. And then whenever kids get a little bit older with eating schedules, some controversy comes around what types of snacks are appropriate for small children. Or one that comes up often is spicy food. So in some cultures, it's completely normal for kids to try all different types of food. In America, we tend to not value that as much globally. And I know in my family, when my children were little, my mom always tried to tell me that I couldn't give um, my baby or, my toddler quesadillas or anything that had any kind of spice to it. And um, my daughter loved them. So it just goes to say that some of these customs of childcare and child rearing, new parents are getting messages about those things. And really, what is important is to make choices that work for your family and protect the children. And then some other ones: handling and caring practices, play and work patterns, initiation rites. So, an example of that in the Christian faith is baptism. Um, that would be a rite that would happen in this infancy or toddler age for particularly for people of the Catholic faith. And then also, and lastly, whether there's formal versus informal learning. And it's interesting that for infants and toddlers, informal learning is usually prioritized more so than for older children. Older children are mostly engaging in formal learning, but you see a lot more diversity in parent choices about whether they send their child to a preschool or a formal daycare kind of setting. And some of that has to do with values, but also it's important to note that daycare is very expensive and it can be very hard for a lot of people to have access to quality daycare. And then lastly, um, the psychology of the caregivers. So, what kind of parenting styles do the parents have? What kind of personal values do they have? What kind of cultural beliefs do the parents have? And what are their developmental expectations? So what kind of education do the parents have about typical development, and would they know if there is something off with development? So now what I want you to do is to take a look at the Padlet and to share your own examples of these different components of developmental niche. So under psychology of caregivers, you may give an example of a client that you had that the parents' values impacted the child, the infant, or the toddler. Um, so that's just one example. But think about your own practice. It can be from your personal life too. Um, but let's come up with some examples to really contextualize this idea of developmental niche.